Welcome to the forum. On behalf of our regular panel, it is my great pleasure this evening to welcome to our program Mr. Les Perce. Mr. Perce was born in Pocatello, Idaho. He is the grandson of Idaho pioneers who settled in the Marsh Creek Valley in the early 1900s. He was educated in the Idaho school system. He holds a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's degree in student personnel for higher education, and is presently completing his dissertation for the doctor's degree in education in the area of counseling psychology from Idaho State University. He serves at this time as a member of the faculty at Idaho State University. He worked 2 years on the faculty and staff at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. He was elected to the Pocatello City Commission, making him the first black elected official in the state's history. He is a member of the Association of Idaho Cities Legislative Committee and is listed in the Outstanding Young Men in America for the year 1974. Mr. Perce has been so kind to be with us this evening to discuss city politics, national politics, and state politics, and governmental problems. Mr. Perce, it's a pleasure having you on our program.
It's very nice to be here, Tony.
I also welcome back all three regular panel members. To my far left is Professor Richard Heinemann, who has been on leave for 2 years, finishing his doctorate in the field of communications at Washington State University. He has returned to North Idaho College, where he was the former chairman of the Division of Communication Arts and now serves as a faculty member in that division. Welcome back.
Thank you, Tony.
I also welcome back Mrs. Mary Lou Reed, who is most active in state politics in one of the political parties. She is also known as an expert in environmental and ecological issues, and did her graduate work in theology at Columbia University in New York City. Welcome back.
Thank you, Tony.
And our third regular panel member to my immediate left is Dr. Ken Wright, who has his doctorate in chemistry from the University of Idaho. He now serves as chairman of the Physical Sciences Department at North Idaho College and teaches chemistry at this institution. Welcome back.
Thanks, Tony.
We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first question this evening from Professor Heinemann.
Mr. Perce, generally, how would you say the value systems of the voters in, let's say, the Boise area differ from those in your part of the state in southeast Idaho? Have you noticed any difference?
Well, I would guess primarily the biggest glaring difference would be probably in terms of political leanings. You know, southeastern Idaho is pretty much known as the area that when you need Democratic votes, that because of the labor influence, at least in the Pocatello area and in southeastern Idaho, it's always gone very strongly Democratic and been very supportive in that area consistently. And I would say the biggest contrast would probably be that in the Boise area, Republican support, which I think is probably manifest in the fact that, you know, our state capital primarily is the professional area of our state. You know, the business people, big corporations are housed in that area, and I think primarily that distinguishes kind of, I guess, the kinds of attitudes that are directed politically.
The recent election, the general election, were you able to detect or discern any shift in, say, values or attitudes in the voters in southeast Idaho more towards a conservative school? I'm speaking up there through Salmon and swinging down into Idaho Falls, well, Pocatello?
I would say that usually consistently in the time that I've been involved in politics, I think as you move north of Pocatello into Idaho Falls area, I think that Republican candidates and the more conservative type of views are supported there, and I think that candidates like of that nature and that leaning have more support in that area. I think that probably in the areas of Salmon, Chalice, and those kinds of areas, that a real reaction I think that we've seen, and from talking with friends that live in those particular areas, has been the reaction towards, I think, the strong support that I think the governor has shown in terms of environmental attitudes. You know, concern about the environment and steps to take to protect the environment. And I think that, as I think is understanding in those smaller areas, they are very attracted by the potential of having industry come in. And they see that as being another boom to their livelihood. And I think anyone could understand that in terms of how they see their livelihood and the potential for growth in their area. However, the population is not there. And I think that, in my opinion, I think what you see is kind of a reaction to that in those areas. And that's why I think you probably saw probably a change in the traditional types of voting patterns in that area. I think it was kind of a reaction to that.
Mrs. Reed.
Well, Les, you're a member of the executive committee of the State Democratic Central Committee, and so I think you probably are concerned about your party and its importance in the state. Now, recently, Steve Sims suggested that Idaho voters vote on the basis of personality because they were able to elect him, at the same time elect Senator Church. Dr. Sidney Duncombe recently was on our program, and he suggested that perhaps our political party system in Idaho is fairly weak, and perhaps we are subject to this kind of personality voting. How do you see a change in this in order to make political parties stronger and more effective so that there is not this sway of personalities? Have you given this some thought?
Well, I think that first of all, it makes the assumption that somehow Idaho is different from the rest of the United States, and I don't think that follows consistently, I don't particularly see Idaho voters necessarily being tremendously different in terms of leaning towards necessarily personalities, but let's face it, in voting, in appeal, in terms of selling yourself as a politician or as a person in terms of your views and winning people to your side, there are a lot of things that are involved in that. And obviously personality is one of them. Intelligence is also one of them, And I think probably the sad part of it is, but in many cases, for most of the people that elect people, of our citizens, that issues just aren't the things that oftentimes convey the things that are the catalyst that cause people to vote for you. And that's not specific just to Idaho. I think it's a universal kind of thing, and I think it shows, and it has been shown by the types of campaigns that people wage, the types of images that people project, the type of communication that they make to the people. They may not necessarily really say anything about in 1964 I was for this and I stand on my record. Otherwise, candidates would not have their children and their wife sitting there with them. Mainly because in the past, at least, it's in some areas, obviously they want someone that seems to be responsible, that has a wife and a family and is a good citizen and has been involved in the community. So obviously there are a lot of variables that are involved in what people view as being the kinds of things that make them want to vote for someone.
But of course some of this is involved with issues and some of it's involved with organization.
Right.
And Idaho voters, I think, like to say that they're independent. And this would mean that they are not necessarily going to sign up with a political party. Now, how are the political parties going to go about recruiting talent in order to make them make nominees available for their as candidates?
I think it's going to be very difficult for parties to do that, and I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think that when there's a state that is independent enough to demand from its people, from the people that are running, issues, and I don't think we should ever forget that Idaho, that we're kind of blessed still in Idaho because we're still small, and the ability for communication at the lowest level to seep down is still within our grasp, and not so much even in a communication media like we're using here, but in a personal level, and I think that, well, I guess probably a fine example that I could probably use would be that, that I've always said that, at least in my experience and viewing Idaho voters, that you can never tell exactly what they're going to do. When I was elected to the city council, the two top vote getters were myself and Connie Hansen, the wife of the newly elected congressman, George Hansen. And I would imagine that George and my views, at least politically in some sense, differ, to a considerable degree. And I would imagine that to some degree his wife's political leanings are consistent with his, I would imagine. And what does that say about Idaho voters? I'm not sure, but I think that we in Idaho somehow have a mechanism to decipher, the things that candidates say to us and what they communicate. That somehow it hits home in some area that really personally affects us. And I think that is probably the biggest strength that any politician or any public servant has. if he indicates in some way that at least for the majority of people that he's in touch with some very major, important concern that they have. And all the time, he can be, in some cases, he can be at odds with their values. Example, Vietnam and Frank Church and the attitudes that he took long before it was ever popular in the United States to take those views. I think that's indicative of the attitude, but I think that Idahoans somehow say, yeah, that's true, and I don't know what Frank's saying there, but he's going to take care of us. And I think that is the overall kind of, conveying message that is an example of the way that Idahoans can compartmentalize things, can compartmentalize issues and weigh them according to the things that really affect them. And I think it's a very fascinating thing. The only danger is it fluctuates all the time, and no one can keep a finger on it. I'm not so sure if that's bad.
But in other words, you're saying that this independence perhaps reflects the fact that we still have kind of a small quality type of state. That's interesting.
Dr. Wright.
Mr. Peirce, you're scheduled to give a lead discussion here at North Idaho College shortly regarding the exact topic, the human values of Idahoans. I'd like to plunge right into that topic, and you obviously must have some strong opinions about it, or you wouldn't want to be discussing that particular topic. How would you characterize the attitudes and values of Idahoans?
Well, I don't think that there's one way that you can necessarily characterize it. I think to some degree we were talking about it just now. Obviously it differs, and I think the big contrast that you see now in our state is the big contrast between the urban and the rural. We're really becoming confronted now with the fact that there are many cities within our state that are being confronted with some real urban-type problems now. And being in a situation where federally we're unable to compete with cities that the feds view as being, real cities, whatever that means. And I guess, that the one thing that I could say about Idahoans that I know it's true for me, is that obviously one thing is for true, and that is that most people don't come to Idaho or live in Idaho because of the money. And I think that says something about the people, the state of Idaho. It certainly says that if it's not the money, then it has something to do with the quality of life. And I think that for the majority of people who live in Idaho, I know myself included for sure, is that I have chosen to live in Idaho because of what we have to offer, what we potentially have to offer the people that live in our state, our offspring. And that steps aside from making $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year and the cost of the hustle and bustle that involves. It's the type of thing that makes a person want to move out into a small community and live there and value the things that are involved in the land. And people in Idaho are still very much in touch with the land, although it seems to be changing a great deal very swiftly. And I think that we're really in touch with that with the tremendous growth that we're facing in the city of Pocatello. But I think that in terms of value, that if there's one thing that really characterizes us as I believe it and feel it, is that, it's got to be. It's got to be that, the essence of that. And I'm concerned that, that many people have finally become to realize that how one lives does not necessarily mean how much money one makes. That once people become in touch with what I call the quality of life, how we exist and how we live in terms of the things that are meaningful to us, that then you have to come to grips with, what do I really, what are the things that are important to me? And I think that more and more people are starting to see that maybe money and all the things that we have been so goal-oriented to are not that, they're important. They're important for survival, but not just as a goal in itself. I'd like to, give you an example of that. At Idaho State University, it has the largest black population of any university in the state. And I remember in the early 60s when I was growing up in Pocatello and going to high school in the area that many of the black athletes that would come to Idaho State at the time, their whole attitude after going to school for a year, playing basketball, and situation in Idaho towards minority people was not the greatest thing in the world at that time. It's improved greatly. Those gentlemen, and that's what they were gentlemen because there were no women at that time, minority women. That was the situation of the times. That's changed in many ways now. But they could not wait to get home, back to Gary, Indiana, back to Los Angeles, back to Chicago, back to the community, where life was. Well, in the last few years since I've been working in higher education, you find students saying things like, you think maybe I can get a job at the Forest Service this year? And things like, when I go home, either my buddies are either in jail, dead, or drug addicts, And I think it becomes very clear, the kind of awareness that people are beginning to have about the things that are important to us, the things that I think that make life meaningful. And more and more people are finding that in Idaho in different ways. Some people, I think, visualize that as being, making it like California. That's scary, but some people will begin to value the things that we offer here.
Mr. Peirce, may I pursue this one step further, what the panel is dealing with? And we're interchanging the terms values and attitudes,
Right.
although there's a distinction to be made, but I don't plan on going into that. I would like to have or give you a couple of concrete examples, not for you certainly, but for the viewers to inform them before you respond. I think when one compares the people of North Idaho in particular with southeastern Idaho, one finds some major contrast, and I would like to get you to respond to it. For example, in politics in this state, a big issue has been legalization or not of certain kinds of gambling, and in the north it's been favorably responded to, in southeastern Idaho negatively in relation to, for example, one of Governor Smiley's campaigns when this was an issue. Also in the area of drinking or consumption of alcoholic beverages, the north seems to have a much more liberal view than southeastern Idaho, and also in relation to our state government, some things they had to do concerning Wallace, Idaho. Southeastern Idaho reacts different than they would in Shoshone County. How do we explain this real great contrast in really attitudes of the people of two regions of the state?
Well, I guess I could address that. I think one primary, very strong influence for southern Idaho was probably the LDS influence, the religious influence, very frankly. And I don't see anything being very unusual about that. I see that, in fact, I would be surprised if that wasn't the case, because obviously religions make up people, and people make up governments and communities, and the values of those communities, And in southeastern Idaho, with that particular religion, does not believe in drinking, or smoking, or gambling, or many of those things. And I think that most religions, to some degree, direct themselves in that area in a negative sort of way against those sorts of things. But I think it's the LDS community in southeastern Idaho is very strong. They're very family oriented, and a strength of people like I have never seen in any other organization in terms of development of the family, and the attitude and the support that members of that particular community have towards each other. And I think that their values that they have there are really very much in contrast with what northern Idaho has. And a good example, for example, is the arrangement that we have in terms of, well, the ability to have alcohol at the University of Idaho, the issue, the kind of, that University of Idaho has very much been influenced by Washington State University. They have that, and I think that it transfers over, in terms of the ability for students to even drink on campus or to have alcohol in their dormitory rooms. So obviously, if the state board can make a consideration for one state college, it should be something that can be consistent for another, very frankly, But I think that the reason why that issue, although it has been brought up on campus to some degree by some students, it is not something that is acceptable in southeastern Idaho because of many of the values that many people in the community have. It's a political thing. It is, and that's a real contrast. As far as gambling is concerned, you forget that Nevada is only about a few short miles from us. I'm really kidding about that, but to some degree. But I think that there is a very strong attitude in terms of very much a moral question about gambling and alcohol, and is viewed very, very differently. Another contrast would be, it'd be very natural for me to, if I was doing a workshop for someone, to say, well, we'll have a coffee break at, 9 o'clock. Well, in many communities in southeastern Idaho, they're largely LDS, and coffee is not a thing that is done. It's a social thing. It's a thing that you learn. It's a certain thing that you learn about people, just like you do in any community, things that are done and things that aren't. But I think that when we get into the contrast of meshing those all together into state law and to talking about things on a state level, and then you get the contrast.
Okay, one more point on that, Les, and that is if you have such basic contrast here as we do and such strong feelings on both sides, does that not affect government in this way, and that is that it's very difficult to have state policies concerning these matters because so totally different lifestyles, and does that not encourage further decentralization in government and allowing local options on some of these issues?
Well, I would certainly hope so, but it doesn't tend to be the case because it hasn't been the case. But I think that probably is a solution to that. And it's certainly something that in municipal government that we have been fighting for. It's a funny thing when you talk about local options, giving communities, cities, at least the ability to make decisions about their community that can affect them directly. It starts at the federal level and goes to the state, and the state says that about the federal government, and then it goes down to the cities. But very much, at least in Idaho, in terms of limitations that we have constitutionally for cities. A city can't even consider leveling an excise tax, to help take some of the burden off municipalities that property taxes weighed on us as a method of gaining revenue is antiquated, and we really should be looking at ways to change that, to take the burden off that. If people in a community decide that, we need this, and this is the way that we're going to go about it. Well, at this point in time, cities don't even have an option to even consider that, to put it to the vote of the people and say, well, maybe we'll have a franchise tax or a tax on alcohol in our community to help raise funds for thus and such, But we don't. And I think that's going to be a very, very strong issue this year in the legislature. And I think that cities are going to be very much organized on those kind of questions,
Thank you. Professor Hyman.
I'd like to pursue this area of how to win an election in Idaho. Before the program, I made reference to Dr. Milton O'Keefe, who's done quite a bit of work in the area of human values. And in political communication. And he made this observation. I'd like to get your reaction, see whether it would apply here in Idaho. He said that most human beings want to be as moral and as competent as they can be. And he said, for example, that McGovern was a morality candidate and that Nixon was a competent candidate. And the trouble with the McGovern campaign is that he projected too much of a moral image and too little of a competent image. And that John Kennedy, for example, conveyed a bit of both images. Now, do you think that in Idaho, that this idea of projecting a moral image and a competent image, or trying to hit a happy medium, is the way to win in Idaho? In other words, what kind of an image should a candidate try to project in Idaho? You alluded to Tommy Hansen's election and your election, and you're both from different...
Well, I think that's a point that, in terms of what he had to say about image, that I think I would agree with. I think that a combination of no, I don't necessarily see a moral image and a competent image as being mutually exclusive. It's a combination of those, and I don't know what that means when he describes McGovern as being moral and our former president as being competent. I think I have an idea, but I think that obviously voters do like to see a combination of that. I think people want that. I think that one thing, though, we have to look at, the different types of people that are being elected across the United States now. The traditional candidate, the person that is married, that has never been divorced. There were a number of people that were running this time that were divorced. There are people that have been divorced and married again, and that is not. Those values are changing. Examples of people's own private lives. That it seems like, I guess after the era of Watergate, that there's developed a tendency for people to really want to know candidates. I don't know if that's to what degree that exists, but it certainly in some areas it has been supportive, and candidates have won in those areas. But I think that an example would be probably Councilwoman Hanson and myself. I guess that if I was to describe, I guess, any commonality between that, I think, Connie is a very fine woman, and I think that that many people in the city voted for her for a variety of reasons. She's had a lot of political experience. She's a very, very kind person, very genuinely so. And I think that in terms of competence, that that her relationship, her background in Congress with her husband is something that was very supportive of her. I think that probably in my particular case, a lot of support that I have had is that my family's been in the community for many, many years. My father and mother were probably the best political campaigners that I've ever had for 28 years, And I guess the fact that I'm a hometown boy, I think, and know a lot of people, and at least on a community level, those are the kinds of things. And I think that people this year, and more so, are looking for people that are unscarred. I think consistently across the United States, whatever that means, unscarred in terms of, even if it means to them that people have, well, at least they haven't been in politics enough to do anything wrong, even if we don't know about it. That's been attitudes for some people. But I think that in many ways, communications from people who have been after this year is that, they're sick and tired of being sick and tired,
Well, now, would you consider George Hanson unscarred, a morality candidate?
Well, obviously, George had his problems, and that is where, well,
Yeah.
What that simply says is that there aren't any absolutes. That
Right.
you're talking in general about what you think, how what do you think consistently people would vote for. The question is, probably, would be, that you would probably raise in regard to that is, what if a candidate had run against him that probably may have had a little bit more financial backing, and may have projected probably a stronger, been able to communicate his competence and morality. Maybe that's the way we should look at that.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Okay.
Mrs. Reed.
Well, Les, now you were a successful candidate, and let's talk a little bit about what it's like to be a city councilman. Did you say committeeman or councilman?
Councilman.
You call it councilman, too.
Commissioners and councilmen.
Commissioners,
That's
all right.
just,
Anyway, what's it like, and what are the primary issues that you're dealing with right now?
Well, it's very, very exciting. I like it a great deal. I have to say that I've just been fascinated by it. I guess in many ways I've always, when I entered college, I was thinking about being a historian, and I was always interested in government and law, and I'm fascinated by our city lawyer. He's probably one of the most competent municipal lawyers, probably in the Northwest, and I've learned a lot the last year, and it's been a week ago, I guess, when I was elected. I learned a lot about municipal law, but more important, I think, what I'm learning is that the neat thing about City Hall, about city government, is it's still the last place where a citizen can walk in and give you hell, and just stand up there and say, and I think it's the only place as well where you can where you're really in touch with the voters, with the people that put you there. Those are feelings that I have about just experiences that I felt. Those are the things that I like about it. I think it's got to be like that. I wish that it could be like that in government in general, but it just seems like that the bigger it gets, the farther away you get. I don't know how we can do about that, but it's a good feeling. It's a very good feeling on that level. Now, with regard to the kinds of things we're into, in the Pocatello area in southeastern Idaho, with the influx of new industry of bucyrus-erie, our projections for 1978 are about 75,000 people or more, and that's incredible growth for a city that I imagine probably is somewhere between 46 and 50,000 now. And we are just faced with a mammoth a mammoth problem of dealing with people that are with the impact that is coming into our city, the way it affects water and police and housing, which is an incredible sort of thing, and the city manager, planners, and all the supportive staff we have a city manager form of government, by the way, have just day after day been involved in one, working with the community, the New Community Act, which deals in the area of housing and deals in a number of areas of sewer and these sorts of things where you have to have comprehensive plans that relate directly to those areas. And we are trying to every week we meet in work sessions, probably 2 or 3 times, just to outline where new water tanks are going, where the sewage systems are going, which way we're trying to encourage growth in the city, because we live in a valley. And I think the big thing that we're confronted with now, and the thing that we're concerned about in our area, is trying to balance out the urban areas with the rural areas. We're in a situation in Idaho where we can see what's happened in other areas of the country, in the East, California, and the relationship between municipalities, urban areas, and rural areas. And geez, we're in a situation where we can hopefully do some things to not make the same mistakes. And those are the kinds of things that we're looking at. I really see those things as really being exciting. You look at them philosophically, and then you start dealing with people, and then you end up somewhere between, I think, is what happens.
Well, how are you dealing with this planning? Are you trying to do it with the city council? You mentioned that you've gone to breakfast this morning and you're meeting
Right.
often. Are you also trying to bring in some citizens groups? Is there any way
Right,
that you
right.
can
You
tap
see,
into them
right.
like Ada County has?
Right. Well, the means by which we're doing that, in 1964, when the Urban Renewal Program came in, one of the qualifications and requirements within that act was that there was citizens' input, that there be committees made up of citizens that had to do with what direction urban renewal went. In the Pocatello area, the urban renewal programs died. The lack of support and some real negative kinds of reaction to those. So there was never any real urban renewal development in the city of Pocatello because of real negative reactions in that area. But the Citizens Advisory Councils lived on, and I was reading in a magazine about, as federal laws and requirements change in regard to citizens' input, then in many cases, local governments were eliminating citizen input, which really concerned me. So being the ex officio member on the board for our Citizens Advisory Council in the city of Pocatello, as well as serving on the Citizens Advisory Board to the state Idaho Housing Agency, the concern about citizens' input is something that's always been very close to me. So immediately I began to talk with councilmen, and we had considerable support for making our Citizens Advisory Council a standing ordinance committee within our city. Very basically saying that this is an essential part of what we need, the perspective out of the ivory tower. It's very easy to get involved with what the limitations of what you can or cannot do when you're looking at it from a city perspective when you're involved in it. I find myself doing it. And it's just healthy to have citizens say, well, why the heck can't you just do this, So we're really encouraging that. In fact, our ordinance passed last Friday. We're in the process of appointing our members for our final committee under our ordinance as an existing standing committee on Thursday next week.
Dr. Wright.
I'd like to question you, Mr. Peirce, about some of these specific things you're hoping to do differently in Pocatello than other places have done. But before we get into that, I don't know if you've had enough experience or not in city government. You've been a city commissioner in one city at least, which is one of our bigger cities in Idaho, for a year now. Do you have any feelings about what form of city government might be the best for the kind of towns and cities that we have in Idaho, or do you feel that's strictly a matter of size and location?
Well, let's see. I would probably guess that it would probably depend on the city. I don't know to what degree size would make a difference, except that probably for a city manager, size is important because the ability to pay a competent administrator to do those sorts of things. But I think that it should be pointed out that one of the first city manager forms of government was formed in 1917 or something like that, and the city was 333 or something like that, you know. So obviously size in that direction, there's not necessarily a correlation in that particular city has had a city manager form since that time. In the Pocatello area, I think that we like that form, you know, and I think that probably there's a direct correlation between that and the qualifications of the city manager. And we have one heck of a city manager. And it's kind of like, I guess, the way that he puts it, you know, a person that is a city manager really walks a tight line. You know, he's a person that should be the administrator of the city. He should be responsible for all the staffs and the departments. And it should be made, I think, very clear to individual councilmen that they do not direct what departments do individually. That councils make the policy, and the city city manager carries that policy out. He serves at the discretion of the council, and as it should be. But I think that in order for him to effectively run a city, that somebody has to know where they go to when there is a problem that they have. For example, the other thing that he has to realize is that he works for the council, he works for the city. And if a citizen confronts a councilman about a problem, and the councilman directs that to the city manager, that problem has to be taken care of. Because, you know, the citizen deals with the person that he elected. And the degree to which his job depends on, you know, the degree that he solves those problems. I like that form. In other areas, obviously, where the strong mayor systems exist, there are, I guess, the advantages there. I guess probably the biggest difficulty would be in a large city, you know, if a person was elected mayor that had no experience, boy, in a large city, the kinds of things that we deal with now in our city that I'm just scratching the surface on. You know, it's just unbelievable. I don't know what I would do if I was a mayor of a city of 100,000 and just coming in with no background whatsoever. You hire an administrative assistant as city manager is what you do, I think. But I'm partial to that particular.
How long has Pocatello had that form?
19 years. 19 years.
You get a chance to get broken in slowly then as an elected city commissioner. You're not immediately responsible like the manager is for the entire operation.
Well, I guess a person could be, but the areas of committees and work that goes on in the city is broken down among councilmen. I have 3 committees that I serve on, that I'm responsible for, that I work with, and that I help. My area of interest, one has always been housing. I'm the ex-official member of our housing authority, and a member of the CAC, and a newly formed committee that we just formed called the Human Relations Advisory Council, which has to do with grievances, very similar to the Human Rights Commission at the state level. Another innovative plan of Pocatello.
Mr. Hurst, while we are on the city government, and since you certainly have expertise now serving as a member of the city council, a new thing in our country as far as the implementation is concerned is revenue sharing coming back to the cities and the counties and the states. And I want to get your reaction, since it's still a new thing and controversial and pro and con. What do you think of revenue sharing in our country? Is it working? Can we improve it if it's not completely satisfactory? And finally, what are you doing with the money in Pocatello that you received through revenue sharing?
Okay. The thing that concerns me is that I hope that in many cases that we get the extension of the revenue sharing program, mainly because I think it's been a tremendous boom to small cities. I know that for our city, the revenue sharing funds that we have received have just been tremendous asset to the city. Now, primarily where our revenue sharing monies have gone have been in services, fire, water, those sorts of things, fire and police mainly, but services towards the community because we're growing so fast. And because of the fact that the demands that are placed on our service system are such that we need more and more professionally trained people, which mean more money, which means, you know, I don't think we should ever forget. It's easy to forget about services of those nature like that until we're confronted with a house that's burning down or in need of a policeman.
One criticism of revenue sharing by some people who have been in opposition to it is that why take the people's money to Washington, D.C. and then send it back, that there's an administrative cost to that process. How would you respond to that? Why do we take it to Washington and then bring it back?
Well, I guess that's because this is the way that things are set up. I think that obviously that is what's happening with the money. It is going to Washington. It is coming back. It doesn't seem very functional. But I would react. I'd say, yeah, it does seem like kind of a crazy thing to do. But I could probably list a horde of things that I think are senseless things that we do in terms of bureaucracy in the country. You know, I think many of us could. But I think that that is a limitation of revenue sharing, but I think that the kind of benefits and the kind of flexibility that it's given our city to free up other forms of money for other areas has been invaluable. Now, the Better Communities Act will be another step in terms of hopefully helping cities, because the philosophy there will be pretty much the same too. Bulk sums of money in certain areas for cities to aid in working in the problems with the problems that they have at the local level, and not having to take step-by-step kinds of progressions to get there. The only problem is that you have to work for 20 years just to do all the assessments that you need in order to be eligible for it.
Two reasons given for this process in other parts of the country, and I want to see if you think that might be true in Pocatello, is that we use this method because it's much easier for the Congress of the United States to tax us than it is for the city government or the state government. In other words, if you do it at that level, they know exactly who the guy is that taxes him, and therefore he gets voted out of office, whereas members of Congress have a higher record of being reelected. So maybe it's more feasible for them to raise the tax. And secondly, under our Constitution, our federal income tax, it's easier to use that method than it is under state constitution, a very restrictive taxing process. Do you suppose that that same policy holds true for the Pocatello area, that tends to be at least discussed in textbooks for the rest of the country?
Well, there's never been a poll, you know, but I would imagine that there would be a direct correlation between, you know, taking all your money down to City Hall, you know. Yeah. It's much easier to write the check out and put it in the mail and say, those back there in Washington, you know. That's an interesting point. Probably some validity to it.
Thank you. Professor Heinemann.
Mr. Peirce, do you think there's going to be a need for federal land use legislation for Idaho and the other states, inasmuch as the states and the local municipalities just don't have the money or the expertise to get into this area?
Well, you know, I think that I personally would encourage and am in support of land use planning at local levels, state and local levels, rather than, you know, federal types of plans that would, you know, try to establish across-the-board land use programs. And mainly, obviously, because the type of land in Idaho and its uses now are much different from what the uses would be in New York now. I think that if that is a problem in terms of financing, you know, people on a local level to work out their planning programs, that there are steps that are being taken in some areas, at least in the area of regional council of governments, with expertise from planners. And if that's a problem, then maybe what the federal government ought to do is supply the funds to aid local communities in working out formats and plans for land use. Land use is a reality now in terms of having to analyze that and look at means by which, you know, how we are going to use land, because, you know, we're still growing, and we just cannot, you know, use lands in the manner that we have in the past.
Well, let's take the federal government out of it and break it down just in the state.
Okay.
Now, do you think that the state should get into it or leave it in the hands of the county? And let's take, particularly in Idaho, the so-called north-south split. We look at land, water up north differently than the people do down in the southern area of the state. Mm-hmm. And in view of that, do you think that perhaps the state as such should stay out of it and leave it in the hands of local administrators like yourself?
Well, I think that, you know, my reaction is that with a proper expertise or TA, technical assistance at the local level in terms of efficient evaluation of what our land problems are, the use, the type of soil, our population growth and pattern, coupled with, I think, the kinds of recreational interests and the type of value that people within our communities place on land, it obviously, to me, you know, makes it more apparent that land use kind of programs should be directed at the local level. with input from people that are going to be affected by that. Then you get into the issue, however, at some level possibly of, a comprehensive kind of land use policy in some areas, at a state level. We're talking about that. In terms of water, water may be a difficulty. The uses that we have for our water now may not be the uses that we have in 20 years from now. I personally think that in 20 years or much sooner, possibly, that my concern would be the water that we have in the Snake River going out of the state, from federal action. That's a concern that I have, and I really see that as being, when we have land to the south of us that was built in deserts and made green by irrigation and continually growing at the rate that they are, and size means strength politically, population means strength politically, that I think that in Idaho we really should very much concerned about what could happen to our particular state in terms of our natural resources at a federal level. And that's not being paranoid. I think it's just a political reality that we have to keep a very sharp eye on.
Mrs. Reed.
Well, the legislative session is coming upon us entirely too rapidly. And I'd like to ask if there's any specific legislation that you or the Association of Idaho Association of Cities are planning on either introducing or backing. I suspect that this ability to levy an excise tax is something that will come up again.
That was something that came up last year, and I think it'll come up again. Personally, I'd like to relate probably an area that I have that is very dear to my heart, and that when I moved back home to Idaho after working in Washington for a couple of years, that I became immediately involved in, and it falls in the area of landlord-tenant legislation. It's something that's become a very real problem in large municipalities, and it kind of goes back to the question that you asked about local, state-level concerns. For 2 years within the state legislature, we have pushed for a comprehensive landlord-tenant piece of legislation that clarifies the rights and obligations of landlords and tenants. Very simply spells out what obligations a landlord has and what obligations a tenant has to a landlord. And trying to educate people in the state to the fact that the legislation is not only needed for landlords, but it's needed for tenants, and likewise, and that both can benefit from a piece of fair legislation. The first year that we presented that, it was just killed. It's interesting. It's given me the opportunity to really see how the system works, and to really see that that the system can work. Time it takes sometimes. Sometimes we don't feel that we have that time, but sometimes that's a mark, I think, of maturity. We brought that piece of legislation back the next year, and last year in the Senate, it became apparent to the opposition, which at that time had been the State Board of Realtors, that there was going to be a piece of legislation that was going to come back again that supported grown for it, and they came in with their own piece of legislation. It was very much copied after the piece of legislation that the Idaho Housing Coalition, that was made up on a state level of all areas, including Coeur d'Alene, and to the south and to the north, all members of the state from every one of the regions had gotten together and developed this piece of legislation through some of the volunteer attorneys within the state. And it became apparent that this piece of legislation might, that it was gaining support. And so last year we came into a compromise on that piece of legislation, came up with a good workable piece of legislation that was fair and equitable, we felt. The problems that we ran into, and this is interesting because then we get into the whole concept of local option and control or comprehensive legislation. We were pushing for a piece of legislation that was comprehensive. That meant that it would apply in Firth, Idaho, just like it would apply in Coeur d'Alene, or in Bone, Idaho, just like it would in Elk City, or Boise or Pocatello. And that's a problem because when we had the hearings on this piece of legislation, I spoke at those hearings, and I think that the way we spelled it out and explained the legislation, we did a good job. But there were people that came all the way down from Grangeville, and I'll never forget the gentleman, him and his wife, and probably 6 other people came down. Very, very nice people. Came down in the storm, down Whitebird, and anybody that'll do that, incredible. But they came down because they were concerned about this piece of legislation, because they were all landlords, and their position simply was, it says, I think of the people that want this piece of legislation, have good intention. It sounds like a good piece of legislation. It says, but one of the areas in that legislation that requires us to make leases, to spell out what the rules will be in terms of renting. You know, I rent to people that I've been renting to for 15 years now. Are people in my community that want to rent from me. I never have any problems with. You know, we're a small community, and that would just be a burden on us. That type of legislation. Very simply, you know, we're very close, and in our community, if Joe wants to rent my place, we set a wage and he pays it, and there's no problem. If there's some problem, we settle it. And you know, it's just too much trouble for us. And locally, we don't think we want that. And there are a lot of small cities that feel that way. It really struck me. That's, you know, what we've been talking about tonight. Very clearly for them, it was something that at this point in time had no application whatsoever for their community. And it would be, as they saw it, solely a burden. But when you get into larger cities, you know, and the problems that are starting to develop, it becomes very apparent that it's a very piece of piece of legislation that's very important. We're coming back this year. The Senate passed it 34-1 last year. And it went to the House, and the person that had been opposed to it the year before, who wasn't reelected this year, tabled it, and it never got onto the floor late in the session. So we're going back.
You're coming back to the compromise.
Yeah.
Well, do you think that cities, you're talking about Pocatello and Boise, do you think that cities of this size can really work with a rural legislature, a legislature made up of primarily rural members? Do you see this as a problem?
Well, obviously, it has been a problem for many years, you know, in the area of reapportionment, you know, and the backbone of our state, you know, is agriculture, you know. That's where the monies are, you know, and there are many differences in terms of the population needs of urban and rural areas. They're real difficult problems, you know, but we've been working on those problems. You know, and I really think that you know, that we have the capacity within the people of the state to continue to struggle with those problems, and probably many times disagree on those problems, and probably many times not come up with anything on those problems. But I think as it has been in the past, and I think it'll be much better in the future, you know, those kinds of problems will eventually be worked out because we're growing, you know.
Dr. Wright.
The Association for the Humanities in Idaho, who helped to support this program, by the way, have identified growth, which is something we've been talking about quite a bit already, as one of the prime concerns of Idahonians. And you have been having to deal with this on a very direct basis with your work as a city commissioner in Pocatello. How do you feel that growth, which seems inevitable for Idaho, is going to impact our state in terms of our resource use, our economic base, political climate, and our environment? Now, those are 4 separate topics, but if you want to address yourself to any one in particular, what?
Well, I think that probably economically, many people in the industry, as we know our economy now, will probably be much better, I imagine. You know, that I think that economically, that'd be a positive side of it, you know, that it's like I said before, people in Idaho don't necessarily live in this state. And the people that live here now, I think, and in the past, because of what that situation has been. I think that the impact it'll have to our ecology will probably be, is apparent, you know, that if there are masses of people, you know, destroy wildlife, puts a heavier burden on our streams in terms of water and the requirements, the direction in which water is used. And it's been a real concern in Pocatello. There have been many people who just said, you know, why do we have to grow? You know, and it's a valid question. Why do we, you know, and the response to many people have been that growth is inevitable. You know, we're destined to go in that direction. That's a difficult kind of thing. You know, one thing, that's what I've been thinking about as well. People say that the optimal city is 100,000. You know, at that point is when all the efficiency starts to break down. Maybe that's something we'll have to look at in Pocatello.
That's something I'd like to ask about.
Yeah?
Tony will give me a chance here. One of the arguments that's frequently used by city people is that if we bring in more industry, well, it'll increase our tax base. And this is going to be a boon to all of us. We'll all be better off if we can increase this tax base. Now, obviously, that argument cannot be true carried out to the ultimate, because if this were true, the biggest cities would be the best off, and they obviously are not by most people's criteria. What do you think about this argument? Do you think it has any validity? Do you think there's a point of diminishing returns?
Why, of course.
Or do you think that the demand for services grows faster than the tax base grows, and it's a phony argument?
I don't think it's so much even demands for services. I think they probably do grow faster, but I'll say it swiftly. I know we're running out of time. That I think that technologically our society has grown immensely. I think that the problems that we have is learning how to live with each other. Learning how to deal in a human way with each other. Those are the kinds of problems that large cities have. And those are the kinds of things that diminish as communities become larger. And I think that's what happens even though a tax base grows and cities get bigger. What happens is when the human problems are developed, then people move out and leave the shells of cities.
With that, Mr. Peirce, I would like to pursue a question that will in the future affect Idaho, because I think Congress is moving in this direction, and that is that there's a very fastly growing trust fund that's building up under interstate highways, and now that we're about through with those, there's serious discussion in Congress to turn this money over to the states for mass transit systems. Well, I don't think we're quite ready for mass transit in Idaho. Are states like our own that are still somewhat small and rural in nature, are we going to be left out if funds are directed into mass transit systems?
Yeah, I think by and large we probably will be. Mainly because, one thing that you have to understand within the federal act that they have is that in order to get any significant amount of funds to make any impact on transportation, and we do have problems in transportation in Idaho, is that you have to be what is called a standard metropolitan area within Idaho. We only have one at this time, according to the 70 census, and that's Boise. And Pocatello, on a regional basis, qualifies under that particular area. But the rest of the cities in Idaho, very frankly, don't qualify for those areas, for those types of funds. And I think we are going to suffer.
Yeah. Is it not possible for states like our own, though, that have congressional delegations to work in an amendment to the this kind of legislation where some funds could be made available for feeder highways or different kinds of transportation that we do need, even though it's not mass transit? And as an urban expert, would you have some opinions on that?
Well, I could say that I know that we've been working in that direction with our representatives on the federal level. But it kind of goes back to the example that we used when we talked about what it means when you have size. You have power, you have influence, you have the numbers, you have more representatives. So for representatives from smaller areas, it's a real battle, because you're talking about the bucks, talking about the money, and it takes a lot of money to run a mass transit system. They don't make money. Mass transit does not make money. They lose. They work on a subsidy, and any city that gets involved in that, most cities, work on that basis. If they aren't going to make money, it's a service that they're offering, and that's primarily to young people and to poor people and the elderly.
One final question to you, and that is, now that you've worked in city government in Pocatello for 1 year, what do you think is the greatest problem facing that city today?
I think probably the biggest problem that we're going to have is, has probably to do in the area of dealing with our growth. Encouraging the development in that area, how the city will grow and in what directions.
With that, I'll have to bring our program to conclusion. Mr. Peirce, thank you so much for being with us tonight, and on behalf of the panel, it's been a pleasure having you.
It's been a real pleasure being here. Thank you.
I also thank all three panel members for, again, very outstanding questions. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest this evening has been Mr. Les Peirce, a city councilman from the city of Pocatello, Idaho. I would like to take this opportunity to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time when we'll be interviewing a personality of the Northwest. Thank you.